Last week we began our study of the Judges, having concluded our study of Joshua. And we introduced this outline of the book of Judges from Wiersbe. Chapters 1 and 2 deal with apathy. There was 3 to 16 apostasy and anarchy 17 to 21. That outline will make more sense to us as we get further into the book. Obviously the apathy makes sense. From chapters 1 and 2 we saw some of their early victories. We saw the repeated defeats. We saw the divine rebuke and their serving other gods. And therein sets the pace for why there's problems in the book of Judges. Tonight we begin the second section of apostasy. And actually this begins the cycle of the Judges of their going into sin because of the problems of chapters 1 and 2. We're going to go back to 1 and 2 and rehash some of that problem to set the pace for what we're dealing with in our study tonight. So we begin the history of the Judges. We'll look at Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Those are the three we're going to consider in our study. Then we'll look at anarchy that arose because of the things that they were doing. I'll remind you each time the cycle of the Judges, and it'll get probably old before we get through, but hopefully by the time we get through the book of Judges, we've gone through that cycle enough you've got it fixed in your mind that I know exactly what Judges is all about. The people start out serving the Lord, they fall into sin, and then they are oppressed by another nation, and then they cry out to God, and then God raises up a judge, they are delivered, they go back to serving God. Now, all of that cycle happened 3 times, or at least twice, in our study tonight. And we'll talk about how Shamgar may fit into that. But 3 times in our study, we're going to see this cycle go, and that's just in chapter 3. So when we get to chapter 4, we see the cycle again. Get to chapter 6, we'll see the cycle starting even again. All right, let's review chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 was about what? All right, yeah, the continual conquest of Canaan, or the continual dealing with the people of Canaan. So we call it continued conquest, chapter 1. Why do we call it continual? Because I thought in the book of Joshua there was the conquest. And all the land had been given. Not an inch of the land that was promised was not given to them. In fact, they divided it up. What's the continual conquest? Yes. Even though Judah has this section that they have, and Reuben has this section over here, and Gad has this section, there are pockets of the Canaanites and the Perizzites and Girgashites, etc., all the people of the land of Canaan are still there that have to be driven out. Their idols destroyed, and the people run out and taken care of and destroyed, and so that they occupy the land fully. They have control of the land, they have their territory, but there's pockets of people that have to be driven out. Now, chapter 2 basically said what? What did we see in chapter 2? Israel's disobedience. So what we had in at the end of chapter 1, before we even get to chapter 2, that Judah was given this section. And what does it say about Judah? The one thing that's the main point throughout chapter 1. Judah has this territory, and they didn't drive all the people out. And then we come to, for example, Manasseh. What happened with Manasseh? Same thing. Didn't drive the people out. You come to Zebulun. They didn't drive the. What about Asher? Well, they didn't drive the people out. Every one of these tribes left pockets of people, and therein is a problem. So now when we come to chapter 2, we dealt with Israel's disobedience. They were rebuked for that. What was their reaction when they were rebuked? This was while Joshua was even still living. Did they act like, I don't care? When they were rebuked, verses 1 to 5, at verse 4, their response was, they wept. Was that true repentance? No, not at all. Because, as we see getting over to verse 19, they continued to do the things that were in their stubborn ways. And so they were unfaithful. They didn't follow after God. And so notice at the end of chapter 2, that God no longer, verse 21, would no longer drive out the inhabitants. The promise of God was, you remain faithful to me, I'll be with you, and I'll drive the inhabitants out. So you don't have to worry about military strength. You don't have to worry about military might or strategy. If you just follow me, I'll be with you, and these people will be driven out. Well, they didn't follow after God. So consequently, verse 22 said that the people were left. God said, I'll no longer drive out any of the nations, which Joshua left when he died. And you might underline if you didn't last week, so that through them I may test Israel. And that's going to set the pace for our study tonight. We made the point last week, if you weren't here, this is a point we need to get fixed in our minds, that God sometimes allows things that he does not cause, and he can put those to use. God sometimes allows things that he does not cause, and he can use those. For example, God does not cause temptation, James 1. God doesn't cause you to be tempted. But since you are tempted, or you put yourself in a temptation, God can use that as a test, can he not? Sure he can. God, there's a number of things God may not cause, but he can use that. God doesn't cause a nation to be evil, but God can use that evil nation to punish another nation. We see that in the book of Daniel. We see that all through the Old Testament. All right, with that in mind, let's go to chapter 3 now. Chapter 3, let's go to question number 1. What judges are mentioned in this week's lesson? This ought to be simple. All right, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Now, those are easy names to remember at this point. Hopefully, when we get through, that you can run through the judges and say, okay, here they are. And you run through all of them by memory. So far, this is pretty easy. Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. And Deborah's going to be next. So we've got 4 right there that's not very hard to remember. Question number 2, why were the nations left in the land? We just answered that. As a test. All right, let's look at chapter 3. We'll come back to the questions. Let's go to chapter 3 and see what happens. I call chapter 3 because this deals with judges. I just put the name of the judges that are dealt with in this chapter. And there's Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. So we have, starting at verse 7, Othniel, and then Ehud at verse 12, and then Shamgar is only one verse dedicated to him. But we have kind of an introduction to this period, even though we've already been introduced to the thought of the book. This period of the judges, this is a continual thought growing out of chapter 2. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time about the nations being left there to test Israel. So let's look at verses 1, 2, and 4, and we're going to hopefully drive home a point that will be helpful to us. Now the nations which the Lord left, now it sounds like the Lord caused that, but that's not what he's saying. He said the Lord left them. In other words, the Lord didn't help them drive them out by their choice. They're the ones who made that choice. But the Lord left them that he might, and you might underline, test Israel by them. Draw a line back up to verse 22, that I may test, through them I may test Israel. God's going to use them as a test. More about that in a moment. That is, all those who have not known any wars in Canaan. He's going to test them, that is, all those who have not known any war in Canaan. Now we'll see more about that at verse 3, or verse 2. That is, here's what do you mean by those who have not known wars in Canaan? So that the generation of the children of Israel might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formerly known it. Now what sense does God want, and he's talking about the children of Israel, God wants them to know war. And so what does he mean he wants his children to know war? That I want my people to be a fighting people, I want them to be a warring people, I want them to be a killing people, I want them to know war. I don't think that's his point. They have, the previous generation, at least those who have for the past few years, that is in the days of Joshua, they knew what it was to go into war and go into battle because they've gone in and took, in their central campaign, the southern campaign and northern campaign, took the conquest. Took the land by conquest. I think here's his point. That is, that they know war is won by obedience to God. I think that's the interpretation. And I'm going to give you a commentary in a moment. And you've got it in your hand. You've got a commentary in your hand. I'm going to show you the best commentary on that drives me to that conclusion, if you hadn't already caught it. And I think you probably have. That is, we're going to look at the context, and the context is going to tell me that. So I want my children of Israel to know war. What do you mean I want them to know that war is won by obedience to God. That's why I left them there. They disobeyed, so they're going to have some problems. I told them it'd be a snare. I told them it'd be a thorn in their side. They're going to be a snare and thorn in their side. And if they're going to get rid of these people and overcome the oppressors, they're going to have to do it by obedience to God. That's what's going to have to happen. Make sense? All right. How do I know that? Well, let's go on to verse 4. We'll come back to verse 3. Let's go on to verse 4. And they were left that he might, here's our phrase again, test Israel by them to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord. Now, verses 1 and 2, it said he left them there that they might know war. Verse 4 says he left them there that he may test them that they would obey the commandments of the Lord. Now, those are not contradictory. Those are saying the same thing. So that's how I come to the conclusion that they know war in the sense that they know they win the war through obedience to the Lord. Does the Lord want you to know war? We're not talking about physical war. Maybe your war against Satan. Maybe your war against temptation. Your war against the battles that are going on in your life. All the things that are pulling for your attention and pulling for priority away from serving the Lord. Whatever's pulling at you, the Lord may be wanting you to learn to know war. What does it mean? Want you to know that war is won through obedience to the Lord. That's a powerful thing to learn. All right. Which he had commanded by Moses. So now let's go back and get verse 3. So what I just learned from verses 1 and 2 and 4, God left the nations to test them. But let's just pause for a moment, though, before we go to verse 3, and we'll talk about those nations in just a minute. I want you to see that God is using something that he didn't cause. In other words, God didn't cause these nations to arbitrarily, I think I'll just leave these nations there and let's just see what that does to them. God wanted them out, and God said, I want you to drive them out, and I'll help you drive them out. But they disobeyed, so God said, I'm going to leave them. And that's going to serve as a test. So here's a question. What's God using in your life as a test? Are you being tested? And you say, well, I don't think God caused, I didn't say God caused these things to happen. Let me give you an example. Sickness, for example. Can sickness be a test of your faith? Sure it can. Does God cause you to be sick? No, there's no evidence that God causes you to be sick. Sickness comes because of sin being introduced into the world to start with. But God doesn't cause that sickness. But that sickness that you are enduring, and it becomes such a sickness that you're really being tested about your faith, and you've prayed about it, and you wonder, why isn't God answering my prayer? This may be a test of you. Not that God caused it, but he may use it as a test. Since you've got sickness, he didn't put it there, but he may use it as a test to see if you're going to stand true in the midst of your sickness. It might be financial reverses or strains. Are you going to throw up your hands and quit on the Lord right in the middle of that? No, God didn't cause that, but he may use that as a test. Let's see if your faith's going to stand strong when things go south. Or it might be a marriage difficulties that are pulling at you. Maybe a job strain. God didn't cause that, but he may be using that. He can use what's left there and say, I'm going to see what your faith's made of in the middle of this. It may be political turmoil as a test. Are you going to put your trust that the Lord's still on his throne and in control? Or are you going to get all excited and turn sideways? Well, I'm going to stop and go to verse 3. That would almost preach, wouldn't it? Verse 3 now. The nations that were left there. I'm not going to trace every one of those because we're going to come to these as we come along through our studies. But the Canaanites, all of the people who were in the land that had been driven out, because it is Canaan, could be called Canaanites, but there were others that were Canaanites as being distinct from those who would have been the Hivites, etc., or the Sidonians, or the Philistines, or whoever it may be. But just giving us a feel for 5 lords of the Philistines and all the Canaanites and the Sidonians, the Hivites, etc. These were the nations that were left there. So there's a sizable group of peoples still need to be driven out. Now, let's notice verses 5 and 6. It did become a test, and they didn't do too well. So let's see what happens in verses 5 and 6. So the children of Israel dwelt in Canaan among the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and Hivites and the Jebusites. In other words, they didn't drive them out. We saw that in chapters 1 and 2. So what was the problem with that? Well, they took their daughters as wives for their sons and gave their sons as husbands to their daughters. They intermarried. What else did that lead to, verse 6? Serve their gods. How'd that happen? Just because you marry people of the pagan society doesn't make you an idolater. How'd that happen? They learned their ways. Psalm 106. Learn their ways. Now, question number 3 is, can you find a passage that says what they did in 3:6 was wrong? Have they been told not to do this? And if so, where? Deuteronomy 7 talks about them being a separate people. They were not to intermingle and intermarry. There's another one in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch. All right, Joshua 23 had dealt with that. Yes, Exodus 34, 15 and 16 had said that. So God had not just hinted at, but God had told them, don't marry these people. Don't marry them. And they did it anyway. Now, I'll give you kind of a comparison and contrast. I don't know of anything in the New Testament that forbids us marrying non-Christians. In fact, 1 Corinthians 7 says if you're married to a non-Christian, stay in that marriage. I don't know of any passage that forbids it. But we warn people that that's not wise. Under the Old Testament, it was forbidden, and they still did it anyway. So what makes us think that it's going to be much better when it was not forbidden in the New Testament, but you just warn about it? People are not going to listen to the warning if they didn't listen to the prohibition. Does that make sense? When they didn't listen to the prohibition, don't be surprised when we warn people that's not wise, that they're going to plow right on and do it anyway. Because people didn't even listen over here under the Old Covenant. All right, Psalm 106 would be a good cross-reference at verse 6 if you don't have that in your text. Now let's talk about Othniel. Verse 7 starts this cycle now. They've been serving the Lord, and now they intermarried the people that they were supposed to drive out after they settled in the land. Joshua's dead and gone, and there rose a generation that did not know the Lord. We saw that in our last week's study, and now they're headed down south. All right, let's see what happens. Under Othniel, we haven't been introduced to him yet, and that is in the order of the text. So verse 7 said, Israel turned away from the Lord. Let's get that picture. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served Baals and Ashereths. Your translation may say groves. It may be a different spelling than what you have. Asheroth is one translation of that. The Baals were obviously idol gods, thought to be a male god. The Ashereth or Asheroth was a Canaanite goddess, the female companion to Baal. And so these are the gods that they served. The god of fertility was this Ashereth and our Asherah. And so they served those gods. And as Stephen just mentioned a moment ago, because they learned their ways, they got familiar with the ways, and they were influenced by the ways of the pagans, because they intermarried them, then they were sucked right into that idolatry. So they've gone into idolatry is the point. Now let's notice in verse 8, the Lord's anger was aroused against them. But notice how it described. Not this didn't go well, didn't please God. How is God's anger described at verse 8? It was hot. God's anger can be stirred, and God's anger can be reduced or allayed, but God's anger can burn hot, and it did. God's very angry with them. So the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, the king of Mesopotamia. Well, let's stop and talk about where Mesopotamia is just for a moment to get kind of a perspective of where we're talking. Mesopotamia is between the rivers. the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And so if you haven't found Mesopotamia, it's right here. This is the land of Palestine right over here. This little body of water here is the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea, and then this is the Sea of Galilee. So this is the land of Palestine. Mesopotamia is over there. And so he sold them into the hand of the Mesopotamians. All right, let's go back and see what happens now at verse 9. Let's go back to verse 8 just for a moment. Israel served. In other words, they basically came as captives or under servitude for how many years in verse 8? For 8 years, they served the Mesopotamians. Now, verse 9, what happened? Part of the cycle. They went into sin, and then God let a nation oppress them. They're under oppression for 8 years. They cry out to the Lord. We're going to see that over and over again. This cycle is going to just keep rolling. So they cry out to the Lord, verse 9. And the Lord raised up a deliverer, and he was Othniel. So, beginning at verse 9 through verse 11, we see God sent Othniel. Let's go to question 4. List some things you know about Othniel. He was the son of Caleb's younger brother. So he's the son of Kenaz, which makes him the nephew of Caleb. Yes, we saw that earlier. And whoever takes this city will be given my daughter, and he took it. So we saw that earlier in our text. Not in tonight's lesson. What else do we know? What was upon him? The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. How long did he judge? 40 years. Yes, 40 years he judged. All right. So let's see what happens here with reference to Othniel, and we'll map him out on a timetable here in a moment. Then we'll go to Ehud. So let's see what happens in verses 9 and 10. God, I want you to notice, the Lord raised up a deliverer. All through the Judges, we'll see the case where not that a man volunteered. I think I can and am capable of being the deliverer. Remember, we defined a judge as a military deliverer. Not a judge is sitting on a bench making legal decisions. They may have done some of that, but it was more of a military deliverer and more of a general as we would think of it. But God did the choosing is what I want you to notice. That God raised him up. This was God's choice. My people need Othniel. God raises up Ehud, and God raises up Shamgar, and God raises up Deborah. So it was not a matter of them voting and saying, well, I think this will make a good military deliverer. God's doing the choosing, and that's what made them good judges. All right. So beginning at verse 9, or middle of verse 9, God raised up a deliverer who delivered them, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. Now remember, we talked in our last study that he was not only a military deliverer, but he was a divine instructor. In other words, he was a teacher and led them in the way of the Lord. And that's evident in verse 11, as we're going to see in just a moment. And so he delivered them from the Mesopotamians, and his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim, and the land had rest for 40 years. So in that cycle, they finally came around, and they have peace from their oppressor, and that lasts for 40 years. So for 40 years, they seem to be doing well, and they seem to be back serving the Lord. And then Othniel died, the text said, after 40 years. Well, I'm learning a very practical thing here about leaders. As long as the leader was leading them in the right direction, they seemed to go. But when he died, then they just kind of go on their own. And so we keep going back to, in principle, to the end, the last verse of the book. Then every man started doing what was right in his own eyes. But for 40 years, they were not doing that. All right, let's just for the sake of it, because we want to keep up with this a little bit, we have the Mesopotamian oppression. The oppression is below the line, and the leader or the judges are above the line. That lasted for 8 years. I don't have the numbers here. But then Othniel judged for 40 years. And now we're going to have another oppression. So let's go to the next section now. Who's the next judge? Ehud. All right, let's talk about Ehud. Question number 5. List some things you know about him. I'm sorry? Left-handed. Reckon why we need to know he's left-handed? Who cares whether he's left-handed or right-handed or blue eyes or brown eyes? What difference does that make? Part of the assassination disguise. That was part of it. We'll get to that in a second. Good point. Do what?
He makes a good dagger.
Yeah, he makes a good dagger. He did. An effective one. What else do we know about him that you could list? Here's what I know about him. He's the son of Gera. He's of the tribe Benjamin. He carried a dagger with him. We know that much. He made one, carried it with him under his clothes. He carried a concealed weapon. He was left-handed. He brought tribute to Moab. How long did he judge? $80 years. Yes. How long was the oppression of Moab? 18 years. The 18 is mentioned at verse 14, the 80 years at verse 30. All right, let's work through this. Starting at verse 12 now. After this first judge, who served for 40 years and they get back on the right track and they're doing well. So now at verse 12, and the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. This sounds like a broken record, like some of the younger ones, well, they would now because they're back out, but the old records we used to play, and the needle get hung and it plays the same thing over and over and over. The needle's hung here because they're doing the same thing over. This is what we just read about. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against them because they've done evil in his sight. So here goes the cycle. They go back into sin. God allows a nation to come in. God strengthened his hand. I think that it simply means God allowed him. I don't think that means God caused, I want you to go attack my people. But God allowed that to happen, and that he did. Now, beginning at verse 13 and 14, the Lord, and I worded it here in the outline, the Lord allowed Moab to oppress them for 18 years. That gives me the impression, perhaps, that the Lord let it go for 8 years. I don't know this. This is some conjecture in my mind. But the Lord let it go for 8 years because that was their first part of the cycle. But this time he's getting a little more aggravated with them, and he allows us to go for 18 years. But nonetheless, verse 13, that the king of Moab gathered Ammon and Amalek, and they took possession of the city of palms. Where's that? Jericho. Couple of references, if you don't have them in the center reference column, Deuteronomy 34:3 and Judges 1:16. We've already seen that expression in Judges 1. The city of palms is a description of the city of Jericho. Well, the city of Jericho has been destroyed and no evidence that it's been rebuilt. So what does it mean he took the city? I don't think this is a great capture from the standpoint he's got a city now under his control, but he uses that region as some have suggested, maybe his headquarters. And so he sets up a headquarters. Now, he's from Moab. Now, let's go back just for a moment to a map and find out where Moab is. Moab, this is the land of Palestine, and this is the Dead Sea, and the Moabites are over here. This is Moab. So this is the Dead Sea, and this is the region of Moab. So they're on the east side of the river of Jordan, and probably had to go up and come across about the region where they came across to go into Jericho to start with. So he's had to come across, and maybe taken some of Gad and Reuben along the way. Some have speculated, we don't know that for sure. But anyway, he has taken the city of Jericho. He's got that under his control. So now at verse 14, that lasted for 18 years. Now beginning at verse 15, what happens? Part of the cycle. They cried out to the Lord. I wondered, were they crying out a little bit through the 18 years and it just got greater at the end of the 18 years, or did they endure this for a while and finally cried out? I'm not sure, but they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord again raised up a deliverer, and it's Ehud. He was a left-handed man, and again, I think that's mentioned to suggest here's part of the storyline of him being able to disguise the dagger. He made a double-edged dagger about 18 inches in length, a cubit in length, fastened it under his clothes on the right side so he could cross-draw with his left hand, and so it would be disguised. And he took a tribute to the king of Moab. Since he's under, what's that all about? What does that mean? Yeah, they've got to pay a tribute or a tax because anytime a nation takes another one under control, then one of the things you want from the people is you want their money. You want some funding from them. And so they take tribute to him. And so he's delivering the tribute of Israel to them. And be that as it may, see what verse I want to notice. Verse 19. Verse 18. When he had finished giving the tribute, the text says, he sent the people away that brought the tribute with him, and he himself turned back from the stone images. Some of your translation will say quarries. That word for quarries, this has to do with stones, but it's a word that this simply means, according to Brown, Driver, and Briggs. That's not a commentator, that's a lexicographer, or lexicographers. They are to the Hebrew what Thayer, Bedag would be to the Greek. And Brown, Driver, and Briggs simply says it means idols. That's all it is. The quarries means idols, these stones, images. And so he turns back from all these images, apparently outside of perhaps the palace where the king would have been. He turns back and sends them on, and he goes back and tells the king, I have a secret message for you. And I notice at verse 20, this is interesting, that Ehud came. He was sitting upstairs in his cool private chambers. Then Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. I've got a message from God from you. And so he arose from his seat. And then Ehud reached for the dagger and thrust it into his belly. One commentator said, I wonder if the king got the point. Well, he must have got the point of God's message. He did get the point of God's message. I've got a message from God, and here it is. Well, he wasn't lying. Some commentators have suggested, well, here's God using a guy that lied. He didn't lie. God did have a message for him, and the message was, you're not going to live. I've got a message from God from you, and you're going to die, is what it is. And so he took the dagger out and thrust it into his side. The details are quite interesting, that he thrust it into his belly, and the hilt went in, and the fat closed over, and that is the handle went in. It went so, you think of an 18-inch dagger that he thrust into his side and through his belly. He's such a fat man that the text describes him as a fat man that it closed in around him and he couldn't pull that out. How did he escape? He stabbed him, and what did he do then? Yeah. Look at verse 23. Then Ehud went out through the porch and shut the doors in the upper room, but no indication that he was running and fright that he's about to get caught, but he went out through the doors and he locked the doors, and when he had gone, Eglon's servants came to look for him, and that they thought he was probably attending to his needs. That's an expression standing for sleep. One translation, I think, I'm not sure about that. It may be another passage where that same phrase is used. Uses to talk about covering his feet. This simply means that he, in the cool of his chambers, that they thought perhaps he's sleeping. So they come in, the door's locked, and they think perhaps he's sleeping. And they waited until they were embarrassed that they hadn't heard from him, and then they found him dead on the floor. So the king's been killed, but the battle's not over. Now what happens beginning at verse 26 through 30? All right, yeah, come and let's destroy and take care of the people, and we'll talk about where that may have taken place. Verse 26, Ehud escaped while they were delaying. All this time they're waiting and thinking the king may be sleeping. And he passed beyond the stone images, that is, the idols, and he escaped to Seirah, which would be a wooded area, and he escaped so that he's no longer seen. And then he blew the trumpet and he called the people together, and let's go fight the Moabs. So they went down and seized them at the fords of Jordan leading to Moab. Now, let's go back to our map just for a moment. I get the picture to be this, that the children of Israel, that is the people of Moab rather, apparently had to come up and come across over here to Jericho, and that's where the battle took place. And so Ehud gets the people together, and they go down and basically stop them at the Jordan River and slaughter them as they're on their way back. And so they can't get back home, and slaughter them right there. How many were killed? About 10,000 were killed. And so verse 28 says they stopped them at the fords of the Jordan and did not allow anyone to cross over. And at that time they killed about 10,000 in Moab. All stout men of valor, not a man escaped. And now verse 30 says Moab was subdued that day. That is, the oppression is over. Doesn't mean that Israel now has captured Mesopotamia and has the control of Mesopotamia like they have much of Canaan. That's not the point. The point is their oppression is over, and drove them away so that they're now a free nation. And so how long did they have rest, and how long did Ehud judge? For 80 years. And so the 18, if you're keeping up, I'm trying to write the years out to the side. Under Othniel at verse 8, there were 8 years of oppression and 40 years, verse 11, of judging. Under Ehud, we have 18 years of oppression, verse 14, and verse 30, 80 years of his judging. So here we have Ehud judging for 80 years. Now, the question now comes about Shamgar, and we're about to get to Shamgar and close this out and then get to some practical things. We have time, I think, to do both of those. All right, what do we know about Shamgar? Question number 6. All right, son of Anath. Killed 600 with an ox goad, didn't he? Yeah. He was. Not much is said about him. In fact, only 2 verses are devoted to him. You say, well, there's only one here. Well, there's another one over in chapter 5, and he's just mentioned briefly. Chapter 5 in Deborah's song. Let's go ahead and get that. Over in chapter 5 and in verse 6 is Deborah's song in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath. And that's about all said about it. Now, all we have is one verse here, and Shamgar is listed as a judge. The details of when he judged is not given. What's interesting about Shamgar, we don't have the same storyline that we had with the first 2 judges. What I mean by the same storyline, he is a judge, and so we assume there is some oppression. We don't assume there's we know there was oppression of the Philistines, but did they go in this cycle again, or was it during the time? Several think, and that's why this map I mentioned a moment ago. Let's go back there just for a moment. That Shamgar, this represents Shamgar right here, this little box right here where my arrow is, that it is thought that he may have judged during the time and overlapped with Ehud. I don't know for sure because the details are not given. And so all the information we really know about Shamgar is given right here in our text. And it says, after him Shamgar, the son of who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he delivered Israel. So did it take place completely after, or did it overlap some? There's some question about that I don't know how to answer. But let's go back and finish up about Shamgar and look at some practical things. Verse 31, Shamgar, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. An ox goad was a pole that was at times to be somewhere 7 to 8 foot in length, and big enough big enough around. I think the circumference was supposed to be 6 inches, but a man could get his hand around it, and he could goad an ox with it. That's what it was. It was to prod the ox. And you think of him, he didn't have a sword. The text doesn't indicate he had a sword or a spear. or any other kind of weapons or a chariot. He takes this ox goad, and with an ox goad, he didn't kill 6 men. He killed 600 men with that. There's something practical to learn from that. All right. Let's go. I think we've got time to do this. Let's go to some practical things, and then we'll quit. Here's some things we learned from chapter 3. We might not have time to deal with all these. Let's get through as many of these as we can. From chapter 3, verse 7, it's easy to forget what's right and do what's evil. Verse 7 said they forgot the Lord their God. How'd they forget? Well, one of the things was they weren't taught, as we saw in chapter 2. There rose a generation after them that did not know the Lord. And it's easy to forget about what's right and do the thing that's wrong. Sin has consequences. God sends an oppressor. Let's go on to number 6. History repeats itself. That's a powerful lesson. And so whatever is going on at any time among God's people, the cycle has been there before. Trials and tribulations, it's been there before. Apostasy, that's happened before. Periods of stress, that's happened before. Periods of growth, that's happened before. History repeats itself. We need to know our history. You see, if Israel had looked back and said, you know what happened under when the Mesopotamians came in, and what caused that, that might keep them from letting the Philistines come in. Let's get back to serving the Lord, but they didn't do that. Number 7, God uses nations, even evil nations, to punish another nation. God still rules in the kingdoms of men. Could God use this nation to punish nations that are evil? You bet he could. Could God use another nation to punish this nation? You bet he could. Because God used Babylon, more wicked than Judah, to punish Judah. I know he can because he did. That's how I know he did. I can. And number 8, use the tools you have. Have you ever thought, if I just had, and you fill in the blank, I could do more. If I just had greater knowledge, I think I could do more. If I had more abilities, Shamgar, no indication. If I just had a sword, I think I could have killed 6,000 instead of 600. But he had an ox goad, and he used the tool he had. God not expecting you to have an elaborate tool. Just use what tools you have. Use what abilities you have. Take your ox goad and go to slaughtering the Philistines, and somebody else has a cannon they can do it with, but all you got is an ox goad. Use your ox goad and use it well. And we'll end on that note right there. Chapter 4 next time.